Does the same thing apply with high amounts of co-ingestion of fats and carbs together at the same time, or do we have a way to partition?
That's a great question. If you have a lot of fat and carb together, that is a particularly fattening mix because you have both of the two components. So first of all, you would burn glucose as the primary fuel in that state because insulin dictates fuel use. If insulin's high, sugar burning. If insulin's low, fat burning. If you've spiked insulin because of the glucose consumption, and you've won with the high insulin, you have signaled the fat cell that it's time to grow. But that alone is insufficient. If I took you and injected a dose of insulin in you, that would, yes, stimulate fat cell growth by pulling in glucose and inhibiting free fatty acid release, and you would faint because there would be insufficient other nutrients in your blood. So I wouldn't have stimulated your fat cells to grow at all because there's no fuel for that growth. So I'm touching on a deeper debate now.
No, this is great.
Which is why do we get fat and how do we lose it? But people, as much as we want to go into separate camps, and people say, no, it's purely calories. We know that's not true. That is so easy to disprove that it's almost laughable that idea still has any credence. Because if we took a type 1 diabetic, our good friend and Dr. Andrew Kutnick, if we took Andrew and had him eat 10,000 calories a day but deprived him of his insulin injection, he would look like a prisoner of war. He would be so skinny, even though he's clearly eating an abundance of calories. If you don't have insulin in an organism, from fruit flies to humans, it is utterly and completely impossible to store fat. So thus, insulin is an absolutely essential component to fat storage. No, but so are calories, because insulin alone isn't sufficient. We need insulin to tell the fat cell what to do with the energy that it has available to it. But we need the energy to actually fuel that growth. So insulin's going to tell the fat cells it's time to grow. But now the fat cell says to insulin, okay, but with what? Now the calories come in. So neither is sufficient on its own. And so this whole vicious debate, and it does get unfortunately vicious. I try to actually take a diplomatic route, but people end up putting me into this endocrine theory of obesity camp or the insulin theory because of what I just said. And I'll say it again with an exclamation mark. You cannot store fat on a body unless insulin is elevated. It is totally impossible. And again, if insulin is absent or really low at low fasted levels, you can't keep that fat on the body. But again, as much as insulin is a necessary component to signal the growth of the fat cell, you have to have sufficient energy to fuel that growth. And that's where the calories, of course, come in, although I kind of changed the topic here.
No, this is wild.
1부에서는 다소 학문적인 내용이 많았는데요. 2부는 시작부터 너무 흥미롭지 않나요? 먼저 비크먼 박사는 탄수화물과 지방은 살이 찌는 최적의 조합이다 라는 주장을 했는데요. 이 부분에서 놀라신 분들도 많을 것 같습니다. 왜냐하면 최근 혈당 다이어트가 유행하면서 식사 전에 지방을 먼저 섭취해서 혈당 상승을 막는 게 하나의 다이어트 비법처럼 알려져 있기 때문입니다. 실제로 혈당을 직접 체크해보면 탄수화물만 단독으로 먹을 때보다 지방과 함께 먹거나 먼저 먹었을 때 혈당 스파이크가 줄어드는 효과가 있는 건 사실입니다. 하지만 여기서 중요한 게 있는데요. 우리가 신경 써야 하는 건 혈당 스파이크만이 아닙니다. 혈당 반응의 이면에는 인슐린이 있습니다. 그런데 지방이 혈당 스파이크를 완화한다고 해서 인슐린 분비까지 줄어드는 건 아닙니다. 결국 내가 같은 양의 탄수화물을 먹었다면 인슐린의 총량도 큰 차이가 없을 것입니다. 오히려 여기서 지방의 칼로리까지 더하면 비크먼 박사의 말대로 살이 찌기에 가장 이상적인 조합이 갖춰지는 셈이죠. 우리가 다이어트를 할 때 경계하는 음식들을 생각해보세요. 피자, 햄버거, 짜장면, 라면, 도너츠 모두 탄수화물과 지방의 조합입니다. 그러니 혈당 스파이크를 막기 위해 통곡물빵에 땅콩버터를 발라 드시는 분이 계시다면 다시 한번 생각해보세요. 결국 중요한 건 섭취 탄수화물의 총량과 인슐린의 반응입니다. 땅콩버터, 올리브유 같은 음식들이 혈당 상승을 막아준다고 해서 살찌는 걸 막아주는 치트키라고 생각하는 건 크나큰 오산입니다. 그리고 여기서 비크먼 박사는 인슐린과 칼로리의 관계에 대해서도 이야기하는데요. 현실을 보면 칼로리를 중요하게 생각해서 항상 저칼로리 식사를 하지만 큰 효과를 보지 못하는 사람이 있고, 반대로 인슐린을 낮추기 위해 간헐적 단식을 하는데도 감량에 실패하는 사람이 있습니다. 이 두 경우는 모두 한 가지 요소만 신경 쓰고 다른 중요한 요소를 간과했기 때문입니다. 비크먼 박사의 말처럼 체중 관리를 위해서는 인슐린과 칼로리를 균형 잡힌 시각으로 바라봐야 합니다. 그러니까 살을 빼려면 무조건 칼로리를 줄여야 한다는 생각도, 인슐린만 낮추면 된다는 생각도 너무 극단적인 접근인 거죠. 이런 관점은 체중 관리를 하는 데 있어 큰 힌트가 될 수 있습니다.
And I want to come back to another question that I had that was surrounding, okay, let's say you have a healthy person, like metabolically healthy, very insulin sensitive. Because that person is insulin sensitive, even in a healthy cohort, is there potential to gain fat easier? So have they kind of shot them? I'm shooting themselves in the foot in some ways, like made themselves ultra insulin sensitive that now they are more sensitive to the deposition or the growth of a fat cell.
Yeah. So the more insulin sensitive a person is, the more potential they have to get fat. But that's not overly surprising because it just reflects this sort of negative feedback or kind of diminishing returns idea of fat gain, that the more fat a person's gaining, the more the body starts to resist that fat gain, assuming that they're getting fat through the hypertrophy of the fat cells, which again is how most people get fat. However, that's the kind of bad news. Like if someone hearing us talking says, oh great, I'm insulin sensitive, I'm going to gain more fat more easily than my insulin resistant overweight buddy. That's true because your buddy's already kind of peaked on the curve. You know, it's this accelerating curve, and the person who's very insulin sensitive is at the bottom, and so they can accelerate weight gain more rapidly. The person who's already been gaining it, they're already starting to plateau, and so it's that diminishing effect of fat storage. However, by being insulin sensitive, they have a little bit of a protection because a little insulin does the job quickly. And by the job, I mean it's able to correct blood glucose very quickly. So as much as the insulin per unit time has a greater ability to promote fat storage on the insulin sensitive person, it's also up for a shorter period of time. So if we took an insulin sensitive individual and an insulin resistant individual, and they both consumed 50 grams of glucose, the insulin-sensitive guy, his insulin levels have gone up maybe from around 3 microunits per mil up to 30 or so, and they're back down to totally normal within 45 minutes. The insulin resist, maybe an hour, 90 minutes, actually. I should have gone a little longer, about 90 minutes. The insulin-resistant guy, same 50 grams, now his insulin has been elevated for 4 hours. And so on the first guy, the insulin is a little more effective at promoting fat gain, but it also was elevated for a substantially shorter period of time. On the insulin-resistant guy, he's become a little resistant to the fat-promoting effects of the insulin, but it was also elevated for 2 or 3 times as long. And so it's a bit of a trade-off.
Yeah. It also makes sense as to why, like when you see, maybe a bodybuilder that gets insanely lean and, for a show, how quickly they go back from 4% up to 10%.
Yep.
I mean, it's very fast, right?
Yeah.
Whereas then it takes them months to go from maybe 10% to 15%.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. I mean, it absolutely really could be just if someone can imagine this curve, which is going up really quickly and then it's starting to plateau a little bit.
Makes a ton of sense.
두 사람은 인슐린과 체중 증가에 관한 미묘한 부분을 이야기하고 있는데요. 여기서는 조금 단순하게 생각할 필요가 있는 것 같습니다. 인슐린 감수성이 높다는 건 신체가 인슐린을 효과적으로 활용할 수 있다는 뜻이고, 이는 대사건강 측면에서 분명히 긍정적인 요소입니다. 체중 증가에 대한 저항성을 만들기 위해 일부러 살을 찌울 필요는 없겠죠. 결론적으로 인슐린 감수성이 높으면 살이 더 쉽게 찐다는 개념은 어디까지나 이론적인 것이고 실생활에서 크게 신경 쓸 필요는 없을 것 같습니다. 이렇게 디테일한 질문을 던지는 걸 보면 사회자인 토마스 딜라워는 이 분야에 대해 과학적 호기심이 정말 많은 사람이구나 하는 생각이 드네요. 그는 계속해서 더욱 흥미로운 질문을 이어나갑니다.
When you look at carbohydrate consumption and insulin, I've often wondered this question. You're the perfect person to ask for it. If you have lower glycemic carbohydrates and you have like gentle bell curve and then another consumption of low glycemic, are you basically getting gentle bell curve on top of gentle bell curve on top of gentle bell curve, where as far as where you're ultimately landing with insulin levels ends up being higher than if you were to just say have a bolus of somewhat high glycemic, have a spike and come back down?
Yeah.
Like, is it better to have insulin do its job, come back down? And what I'm getting at is like allocation of carbohydrate consumption to maybe 1 bolus per day and then come back lower, or frequent smaller boluses.
Yeah. I wish I could cite a definitive study on this question, so I have to speculate because I don't know that this has been done. I am speculating. A lot of the reason I put carbohydrates in the crosshairs is because of what it does to insulin. I want to make sure people understand that I'm not declaring war on carbohydrates because of the entire macronutrient class. It really is the subsequent question, which is what does it do to insulin? So I appreciate the question because that's how you're framing it. Remember, with that in mind, insulin's most famous action, but far from its only action, and I would even say not even its most important, but insulin's most famous action is to control blood sugar. Now, I emphasize that because a lot of what is wrong in modern clinical care when it comes to insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes therapies is that they think it's a glucose problem. It's not. These are insulin problems, and if we look at them as insulin problems, we address them much more effectively than if we look at them as a glucose problem. But that's a little bit of a tangent. But even still, if we're asking the question, what happens to insulin? My question is always, or my solution is always, the longer you spend in a state of low insulin, the better. For being lean, for cognitive health, for cardiometabolic health, all of these reasons, longevity, the more insulin is at a kind of basal state, overall, the better you're going to be. So I would actually say it would be one bolus up and down would be better, especially because you can manage that one dose. You know, if you know, okay, lunch is my main carb meal, then you're able to couple that with, I'm going to eat this bigger carb meal and I'm going to go on a 15-minute walk. Or it's just so much easier to manage that one moment rather than, okay, I'm eating some carbs now, I'm getting an insulin spike, and before it ever comes down, I'm eating some more. Now I'm eating some more, but I'm spreading it out more. I think that's actually part of what's gotten to the modern epidemic that we're in with regards to metabolic health. Insulin resistance is the most common health disorder worldwide, which is why I beat that drum so loudly. The reason I did my postdoctoral fellowship in far-flung but lovely Singapore is because even in the midst of the beautiful islands of Southeast Asia, the actual rate of type 2 diabetes is higher than we have it in the US, in beautiful little Singapore. And as you look around the world, the Middle East, North Asia, Southeast Asia, Pacific Islands, even in our own neck of the woods, Mexico has higher rates of diabetes than we do in the US. This is an absolutely global problem. And a lot of it is because about 71% of all calories consumed globally are carbohydrates, often refined. And we've been told to eat 5 or 6 times a day. And so you never give your body a chance to lower the insulin because it's going to take a couple hours to do so. And the longer a person is living with elevated insulin, the more that chronically elevated insulin is causing insulin resistance. Elevated insulin is the primary driver of insulin resistance. But then, of course, to the astute listener, they might recall that just moments ago I said that hyperinsulinemia or elevated insulin is also a chronic feature, an inseparable feature of insulin resistance. So you end up creating this vicious cycle where the more frequently you're spiking your insulin, the more you're promoting insulin resistance, then the more insulin you need to control your blood sugar now because insulin isn't working as well, which is further driving insulin resistance. So the solution is to just get off this hyperglycemic roller coaster. But anyway, to bring it full circle back to your question, with some speculation noted, I would suspect it's better to just have one bolus. Get those starches and sugars in. You've done it. You're done. Now, as rapidly as you can, you want to bring that insulin back down. Now, I don't even want to sound like insulin is just this uniform villain. We must have it. The absence of insulin is a death sentence. It's just that we live now in a day in time where we're spiking it all the time. And it's just too much of a good thing. Too much insulin is the primary cause of insulin resistance.
비크먼 박사는 혈당이라는 요소만을 바라봐서는 안 되며 인슐린을 낮추는 것이 궁극적인 해결책이라는 점을 강조합니다. 우리 주변에는 맨날 야식 먹고 간식을 먹는데도 혈당이 정상인 사람들을 쉽게 찾아볼 수 있습니다. 하지만 겉으로는 문제가 없어 보여도 그들의 몸속에서는 혈당 수치를 정상으로 유지하기 위해 인슐린이 과도하게 분비되고 있을 가능성이 큽니다. 다시 말해 겉으로 보이는 혈당 수치는 정상일지 몰라도 이미 진단되지 않는 당뇨가 진행 중일 수 있다는 뜻입니다. 그러니 혈당 수치가 정상 범위에 있다고 해서 안심할 수는 없습니다. 우리는 혈당뿐만 아니라 인슐린이 항상 높은 상태로 머물지 않도록 관리해야 합니다. 결국 혈당이나 인슐린이나 그게 그거 아니냐라고 생각하실 수도 있습니다. 하지만 이러한 오해 때문에 앞에서 이야기한 것처럼 혈당을 낮추기 위해 사과에 땅콩버터를 발라 먹거나 밥 먹기 전에 올리브유를 한 스푼씩 먹는 식의 잘못된 솔루션이 등장하게 되는 겁니다. 이는 마치 집안에서 나는 악취의 원인을 제거하지 않고 향수로 냄새를 덮어버리려는 것과 같습니다. 또한 그는 자신이 인슐린을 악마화하려는 게 아니라며 과도한 해석을 경계했습니다. 사실 인슐린과 혈당 조절이 이처럼 강조되는 이유는 음식 문화의 발달과 끊임없는 간식 섭취가 일상이 된 현대사회의 배경 때문입니다. 우리 몸에서 불필요하게 존재하는 건 아무것도 없습니다. 단지 어떤 요소든 과도해졌을 때 문제가 발생하는 것이죠. 따라서 우리는 문제를 해결하기 위해 무엇을 완전히 끊거나 한 가지 요소에 집착하는 것보다는 적절한 균형과 조화를 유지하는 것이 더욱 중요하다고 생각합니다. 이제 인터뷰는 단백질이라는 또 다른 흥미로운 주제로 넘어갑니다.
Yeah. And I think it's safe to assume, I mean, no one's getting insulin resistance from the insulin spike you get from protein.
Oh yeah, no, well, that's right. But in fact, even then, when I was first getting familiar with this low carb community, because remember, I'm a professor and a scientist. I was totally unaware of this whole community of at the time just kind of low carb. One of those early talks I gave was to dispel the idea of protein being a problem on a ketogenic diet, where it was very odd to me to see as an outsider, as just a pure scientist, people saying, well, don't eat too much protein because you don't want to get kicked out of ketosis. And I just thought, what an odd concern, especially in the context of a low-carb diet, because a lot of the evidence has shown that the insulinogenic response to a dietary protein load really depends on the underlying glucose level. So to put that very clearly, if someone eats a protein load in the absence of glucose and they have normal glucose levels, there is little to no insulin release. This is very Nuttall, N-U-T-T-A-L, through a series of experiments, really nailed this and displayed it really well. So again, if a person eats a pure load of protein in the absence of any glucose and they have normal glucose levels at the time, there's very little insulin spike. If a person takes that protein with glucose or has underlying hyperglycemia, then you will get an insulin spike and you will amplify it beyond the carbohydrate alone. And that's really in part because of what the body has to do to keep gluconeogenesis happening. If you're fasted or on a ketogenic diet, if you spike insulin, you stop gluconeogenesis and you would become hypoglycemic very quickly and you would likely go unconscious. And so that makes sense that the body won't elicit an insulin spike, because if it did, again, it would shut off the liver's ability to make new glucose. And so you can't sustain it. But that does present a bit of a note of caution, as much as you and I both are big advocates of protein, and I am. And if a person has type 2 diabetes, they actually may find that controlling protein a little bit is helpful in that population. But there's a lot of nuance there. But on average, I'm an enormous advocate of protein. Even if there is an insulin bump, it is a macronutrient that I'm tremendously in favor of. Now, having said that, lest someone misinterpret it, I'm an advocate of natural protein, especially, which is the protein that it's always going to be animal. Natural protein is animal source protein, and natural protein always has fat. There's almost no instance in nature of a protein not coming with fat, and I believe that's how we should consume it.
최근 단백질의 중요성이 널리 알려지면서 몇 년 전까지만 해도 일부 운동 매니아들의 전유물로만 여겨지던 단백질 음료가 이제는 편의점에서도 쉽게 구할 수 있을 만큼 대중화되었습니다. 하지만 모든 것이 그렇듯 단백질도 어떻게 섭취하느냐에 따라 오히려 체중 증가의 원인이 될 수 있습니다. 우리가 섭취한 단백질은 다른 영양소와의 조합, 그리고 신체의 대사 상태에 따라 다르게 활용되기 때문입니다. 우리가 접하는 단백질 섭취와 다이어트 관련 정보는 대부분 피트니스 업계에서 시작된 경우가 많습니다. 보통 보디빌딩 식단을 떠올려 보면 단백질과 탄수화물 비율이 높고 지방 섭취는 최소화된 형태인데요. 흔히 닭고야라고 불리는 닭가슴살, 고구마, 야채 조합이 대표적이죠. 이런 식단은 근육량 증가와 체지방을 최소화하려는 보디빌딩의 목적에 맞춰진 것이지 건강을 위한 최적의 영양조합은 아닙니다. 게다가 일반적으로 퍼져 있는 단백질 섭취법 중에는 과학적인 검증 없이 상업적인 이해관계에 따라 확산된 정보도 많습니다. 예를 들어 운동 후 기회의 창이 열리기 때문에 1시간 안에 단백질을 섭취해야 한다. 근육 합성을 위해 3-4시간마다 단백질을 보충해야 한다. 이런 주장들이 대표적이죠. 그러다 보니 단백질을 지방과 함께 먹어야 한다는 개념은 많은 분들에게 다소 생소할 수 있습니다. 그동안 우리가 접해온 정보와 정반대의 이야기처럼 들릴 수 있기 때문인데요. 사회자인 토마스 딜라우어는 보디빌딩 경험이 있기 때문에 이러한 일반적인 믿음의 문제점을 누구보다 잘 이해하고 있습니다. 그렇기에 그는 단백질 섭취에 대한 논의를 깊이 있게 이어가고 있는데요. 이에 대해 벤 비크먼 박사는 과학적인 관점에서 흥미로운 해석을 제시하고 있습니다.
We do have human evidence to show that if a population of humans works out, they eat protein, they get a certain greater degree of muscle protein synthesis. If they eat protein and fat, they get even more muscle protein synthesis. Part of this could be because of what the assistance of bile. As much as we think of fat digestion and we think of bile coming from the liver, then the bile duct or the gallbladder as being only relevant to fat consumption, and it is very important for fat consumption, but we also use bile to accelerate the proteolytic enzymes of digestion in the gut. So we have these distinct class of enzymes, the proteolytic enzymes that help with protein digestion. We have bile and then some fat-specific enzymes to help with fat digestion, but bile also facilitates the actions of the proteolytic enzymes. And I don't think it's an accident, again, that in nature, all fats come with protein. In our fear of fat, we have separated the two, and I think that's why a lot of people, if they find they just take pure protein, it really upsets their intestines. They probably because they're losing out on the facilitative actions of the bile, which helps protein digestion, but you're only going to be releasing the bile if you eat some fat. So as much as I am an advocate of protein, and I am happy to admit it, I also don't want that to be taken as I'm now suddenly saying it's more important than anything else. Protein is important, but so too is the fat that's supposed to come with it.
Wow, that's wild. I mean, that's interesting to me because, coming from like a fitness perspective, like somewhat speculative, but it was like then somewhat validated where, okay, like, hey, like you finish your workout, like you're insulin sensitive, like now's the time to have your whey protein shake, just get a lean, easy protein.
Yeah.
So is there evidence even like post-workout that sans carbs, just having like some ground beef, some fat in it might actually get you more protein synthesis than say a whey protein shake?
Yeah. Well, so this study